Alright, listen up and listen good, because we only got just under 9 minutes to talk about the Black-Tailed Prairie Dog, and I do apologize, my voice is blown out due to singing in the car, but we won't get into that. So, the Black-Tailed Prairie Dog. The current extent areas that they live are Montana, the Dakotas, Wyoming, Nebraska, Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, and Chihuahua, Mexico. Some of them have been seen up in Alberta and Saskatchewan, but that is not confirmed, at least not by what I found online. They also used to exist in Arizona, but are currently extinct in the region, unfortunately. Speaking of their numbers, they actually used to be one of the most populous animals in the nation, roughly being anywhere from 10 to 20 million, but are currently down 95% from their original population. Now, that also still means there are millions of them all throughout the Great Plains. However, it does show that even something as small and minute as black-tailed prairie dogs tend to have a bit of an extermination problem. Mostly because their burrows end up breaking the legs of horses and cattle and all sorts of other farm animals, along with just being an absolute menace. They are also known to cause some damage to root structures of arable crops, such as corn, potatoes, wheat, whatever they would be grown out there in the Great Plains. And on top of all of that, this is the first animal that I get to discuss how delicious they are. Now, I've never had one, however, I did look into how often they are hunted, and in rural areas of the Great Plains, it is not uncommon to have black-tailed prairie dog in a barbecue. For instance, the information I could get on the taste of a prairie dog, or pea-dog, as some of them call them, is something similar to gamey goat meat. Take that as you may. If you've had goat meat, just imagine it mixed with venison. I don't know. As for the environment that we're going to be making, as you can see, I am instituting the very famous rock outcroppings that can be found all throughout places like Utah. God, this is really difficult. I gotta get it done. Now, before we get too into it, let's actually discuss the animal's name. So, despite being called a prairie dog, it is actually more related to ground squirrels than any sort of dog. And I think that should be obvious from the way it looks. However, I could also see how people might be confused if they would be considered closely related to groundhogs. But the scientific name of Cynomys ludovicianus, first half of that being the prefix term for dog, the letter O to combine with the suffix of the Latin term for mouse. Now, interestingly enough, the second half of its name is kind of confusing because it has to do because the term ludovicianus comes from a post-classical Latin term of Ludovicus, which derives from the royal name of King Louis XIV, which would also mean it is of Louisiana. Now, that may be a little confusing to some of you, but there are two hypotheses I have. First and foremost, being one of the two prairie dog species that were discovered in the Lewis and Clark expeditions, I could also see the possibility of using Lewis's name as inspiration. The other option, which I think makes more sense, seeing how it's supposed to be of Louisiana, is that the region that this animal was found at the time was still known as the Louisiana Territories, which was recently purchased by America from France so that they can help aid in their current wars under the reign of Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, the actual scientific name was given by George Orr Jr. in 1815. So, that is one of the reasons I see it as more likely be the name coming from the Louisiana Territory. Now, as you can see, I started working on a larger underground system that, in theory, is going to play the part of the main hub of the prairie dog tunnel. Now, being an animal that thrives mostly underground, it is important to note that the colonies of the prairie dog are very determined by these burrows. Now, colonies can range anywhere from 5 prairie dogs to literally thousands. And they're usually divided similar to human settlements. So you'll have the colony itself. Then you'll have little family groups that would neighborhoods, and they would pretty much be the greater colony area. So they'd be close together, but not connected in a physical tunnel system like some animals might be. Now, typically, these family groups will occupy roughly an acre of land, and that can range in the 20s, just about. Now, there are also reports of prairie dog towns, essentially a very large swath of area consisting of many colonies of many families that would take a large area. The largest ever found was in Texas and was reported to cover 25,000 square miles and included 400 million individuals prior to the habitat destruction. Now, we touched a little bit on the actual conservation efforts of this animal, but it is also important to note some of the reasons. I've discussed their damage to property and animals and farmland and all that fun stuff, how they are a delicacy for the longest time, including from the Native Americans to modern rural America. But there is also one extra one, and that is the fact that the black-tail is the most common prairie dog to exist in the exotic pet trade. Now, the prairie dog is a keystone species meaning that if they are to go extinct, the entire ecosystem of the Great Plains would most likely collapse. Due to their extensive tunnel systems and the fact that they populate in such a large quantity, and being a rodent, they repopulate very, very quickly, they are a great source of food for many of the smaller and even larger predators on the Great Plains, including, but not limited to, badgers, minks, hawks, snakes, coyotes, foxes, you name it, it probably eats it. And due to the way that they consume their food, being different types of plant material throughout different points of the year, meaning that this animal not only benefits the animals up it in the food chain, but it pretty much benefits every single animal and plant in its ecosystem, something that not many animals can really hold to their name. However, it is very interesting. Now, as for eating, they don't actually feed any further than 16 feet away from their colony in any one direction, so if you ever see one, understand you are not far from most likely hundreds more. Now, let's get into the cultural part. I've already talked about modern culture with the fact that they are used in the exotic pet trade and for consumption. However, I do wish to talk a little bit about the Native Americans. Unfortunately, I do not have many reliable sources. I have to go off of the internet, and I hate that because I love to learn about Native American mythology, history, etc. But sources are not always reliable. So the two main things I could find, and while there were many stories, I use in quotes, that claim that Native American culture includes prairie dogs, most of what I could find would be a role similar to mice in European fairy tales, and or being representative of a certain group that is the main focal point of the story. Now, there is one direct story that I would like to talk about, and the only reason I would like to talk about it is because I found it interesting, and if it is true, it would bring me great joy to the episode. And it is a story that allegedly Ikaria Apache had a story where a very dehydrated and tired man is desperately trying to make his way throughout the Great Plains in an attempt to reach home after a long day of unsuccessful hunting. Eventually, after dropping everything he had in an attempt to make it easier for him to make his way home, a prairie dog had run up to him with a small cup of water, imploring the man to try and drink as much as he could. The man did not think much of it, since how could a small cup that could fit in the hands of a prairie dog possibly quench his thirst? But he figured, hey, something's better than nothing, so he went and drank from it, and drank from it, and drank from it, to the point where he couldn't finish the cup of water. So he drank until he no longer felt dehydrated and felt like he had the strength to move on. The prairie dog then tells him, continue that way, and eventually you will find more men, and they will get you the water you need. This man picks up all of his things and continues off in the direction where a large rainstorm comes by, something very unusual for the Great Plains. And from that moment forth, it was seen that the prairie dogs are able to summon storms and rain when needed in the Jicarilla Apache mythology. And that is all I have. I do apologize if I do sound awful. I wanted to get this done within the week, so we're just going to have to deal with the sound of my voice. This was very difficult to make, and I hope you enjoyed. I'm sorry it was so quick, but it wasn't that difficult to make the exhibit itself. I had an idea, and I stuck with it. How you feel, but I feel it looks beautiful. So until next time, when we talk about the mysterious bongo, one of my favorite antelope species, have a good day, have a good life, show love to those you care about, go outside, and bye-bye.